This is Partners in Crime with Adam Croft and...
Not the other one. Hello and welcome to another episode of Partners in Crime, a potentially short one this week, and definitely a slightly croaky one as I still overcome the lurgy. Mr. Dawes still away touring with his evening job, so I'm joined again by the wonderful Mr. Adrian Hobart.
Hello, thank you very much for having me again.
No, thank you for coming back on again. I think you're absolutely mad. It's about 3 times now.
It is.
Have you been doing much reading this week? We might as well get straight into it and talk about some actual crime, hadn't we?
Yeah, absolutely. No, well, you know, I've let the day job dominate my reading as I'm working on one of your books. But it's,
sorry about
that. So crime has sort of taken a slight back step. But, you know, the interesting thing in our household is that my partner Rebecca has become an absolute crime nut now. Having sort of pushed that genre away from her reading, she just can't get enough of it. In fact, she's, as I speak, in Waterstones trying to find something to you know, fulfill her fix of crime literature. So she really, I think if there's one thing that's changed in the last month, it's that.
What was that? Was that Partners in Crime? Was it Morecambe and Vice?
Yeah, it was. And yeah, I mean, certainly the podcast played a part in it, but I think, you know, we rub shoulders with a lot of people who write crime for the first time and, you know, meeting people who love it. And so we bought, I suppose between us, we bought half a dozen titles each, I think, off the bookstall, different things, and she's been dipping into all of those and just getting addicted, frankly. So that's really wonderful.
This is where it starts. I think
absolutely.
One book you were telling me she was reading, I think, was one that I've just finished reading this week, which is The Closer I Get by Paul Burston.
Yes.
Who is lovely, lovely guy as well. Fantastic writer. I hadn't actually somehow, for some reason, read anything of his until now, and I met him at Morecambe and Vice, picked up the book, and I think I mentioned it on the live show we did at Morecambe and Vice, but finally got around to reading it, and it is absolutely brilliant.
Yes, she said the same. Absolutely phenomenal, she said.
Yeah, it's a psychological thriller, essentially, from the point of view of an author called Tom, who picks up a stalker, essentially, on social media, and it jumps about in time frames before and after the trial, and various things that happen to Tom and to Evie, his stalker, who writes her chapters from a first-person point of view to him in letters, essentially. It's just extraordinary. It's definitely a page-turner. It pulls you through, and you never quite know where it's going. The characters are all very interesting and believable. It's a small cast, as I believe you should have with psychological thrillers, to keep it nice and tight and nice and twisty. And it's just a brilliant read. That's you know, I can't go too far into it without giving the game away. But I would strongly recommend that book, The Closer I Get by Paul Burston.
Yeah, it sounds like a really complex, you know, way of plotting it and delivering it, but it's pulled it off. So, you know, chapeau, as they say in cycling.
Indeed. And if you like the sound of The Closer I Get by Paul Burston, or any other books we talk about on today's show, head over to kobo.com, and if you're a new customer to them, enter the promo code CRIME at the checkout, and they'll give you 90% off of your first purchase. And you can also get 40% off of selected crime books for life using the link in the show notes and the promo code PARTNERS. Thank you to the lovely people at Kobo for doing that and for sponsoring Partners in Crime. I had a little look at the news this week, as I tend to do before we do these shows, and I spotted something in the Daily Express, and I'm not going to do my usual joke of saying I read that from cover to cover every day, because I do not. But there was an article in there published by John Coates about Martina Cole, with the title with the title "Best-selling author says she is victim of snobbery in publishing." And I thought, well, you know, Daily Express are known for being quite strong on their clickbait game, and I fell for this one and I clicked on it. And it's a very interesting article about Martina Cole, who is obviously a very extraordinarily successful author. In fact, she is sales of her books have passed £63 million. She is Britain's best-selling female crime writer since records began. It says here her first novel, Dangerous Lady, was the first paperback original to be published in 1992, because before then it was always a hardback, and then the paperback followed months later, which, you know, some stuck in the mud publishers still do. She's had 4 novels adapted into TV dramas, and she then goes on to say, what should matter is that your books are popular, but unfortunately it doesn't unless you're an academic or a man. Which I find extraordinary from somebody who's sold £63 million worth of books, who later in the article talks about the fact that she shares her time between her mountain home in northern Cyprus, the 2 bookshops that she owns, and the 15th century manor house in Kent that she lives in, and the fact that she has, you know, sports car and all the rest of it, and absolutely fair play to her, deserves every bit of it. But I must admit, I put this entirely on the journalist and not on her. Not entirely sure where she's the victim of snobbery in publishing. I must have missed that bit.
Well, it's an interesting thing because she's very genuinely, you know, an East Ender, has grown up around the sort of people that she describes. I remember I watched a video not so long ago of her hosting one of the, I think it was actually Charlie Richardson himself, you know, talking about his life in northern Cyprus in front of an invited audience. You know, from the Richardson gang, who used to dominate the South London scene, were great rivals of the Craze, with, you know, Mad Frankie Fraser and all that sort of thing. So she's well connected, and she comes from that genuine background. And yes, she's not one of those people who can put on airs and graces that so many authors seem to. You know, if you watch the Booker Prize coverage in the UK. Everyone's sort of incredibly well erudite, and, you know, I thought it was wonderful and all that sort of thing. And that is publishing. I think if you go to a book fair, it's one of the poshest collections of people you'll ever meet. Certainly from the British side of things, it's, you know, it's a lot of.
I mean, that is changing though. I think that snobbery in publishing is changing. I mean, you know, it's obviously she's done phenomenally well, even with that kind of snobbery that she perceives to be there, which. It certainly is there. You know, she's certainly right. There is a snobbery in publishing. I'm not entirely sure she's been a victim of it, looking at the level of success that she's had.
No, but I mean, you know, she's if you're in a supermarket in the UK, her latest novel will at least be one copy of that on sale. Or if not, some of her backlist as well. You know, I think that's where the snobbery comes in. It's not that, you know, necessarily she's going to be, you know, a big feature at a Waterstones or something, or a Blackwell's or something like that. You know, she's going to be, she's available at £4 at a Tesco.
So are her books, by the way. And moving swiftly on, from snobbery to robbery, an article I saw in the Columbian newspaper, based in British Columbia in Canada. Of course, I read it from cover to cover every week, or every day, however often it comes out. There's an article here which opened with the words, "Authorities thought they had stopped a drunk driver. The man they arrested turned out to be a convicted bank robber." Not only that, but the driver of the car they stopped was identified as 68-year-old Ralph Griffith of Vancouver, who had been convicted of bank robbery in the 80s and early 2000s and had since written books glorifying heists. Turns out this chap is a best-selling author, former bank robber, who apparently, it seems, was still at it and had been arrested. You know, they pulled him over thinking he was a drunk driver. Turns out that he was a chap they wanted for some robberies in August of this year. So apparently it seems he's still at it. Perhaps the books aren't selling all that well. When he was in Carson... Sorry, go on.
Or is it a research project on his behalf? You know, you've got to keep your hand in, keep up to date with modern techniques, you know. If
he's got a good brief, that'll be exactly what he says.
It's tax deductible.
Well, yes. In 1986, he was found guilty of robbery in the Middle District of Tennessee. He was sentenced to concurrent 20 and 25-year prison sentences. In 2004, he was sentenced to 120 months imprisonment and 3 years of supervised release for 3 counts of bank robbery. And while he was incarcerated, he claimed to have gained proficiency in Mandarin, Japanese, German and Spanish. And he also became a prolific author who's written 6 novels. And it sounds as if, we don't know what's happened. He was back in court on October the 24th, apparently, in Canada. And I guess if he's found guilty, he'll have some time to write some more novels. But I thought that was all very interesting, actually. We spoke, I think, a few months back on Partners in Crime about a Chinese author, I think it was, who turned out was actually a serial killer, and the books that he'd been writing about these murders were actual real ones, and it's pretty kind of semi-autobiographical. I thought that was quite interesting. So, we are a weird lot, I guess, us crime writers. In some ways.
What's the phrase? Write what you know.
Well, indeed. It reminds me, actually, I did, just over a year ago, I was interviewed as part of the Milton Keynes Literary Festival. Yes, believe it or not, there is one. And a lady came up to me afterwards and said, I just wanted to say, you seem remarkably normal and quite nice. I said, well, thank you. I'm not entirely sure that's an event in itself, but thank you, I think. And she said, no, I mean, I've seen your books and you write about some really horrible things and people being murdered and some horrible stuff. And we actually sat down, we had a chat about this for about 20 minutes, and I found it really quite interesting and intriguing. And the conclusion I came to is the reason I write about death and destruction is that I'm actually terrified of it. I'm terrified of the thought of dying. I don't deal with death well at all. I don't deal with any form of emotion that well at all, to be quite honest with you. But I think it's my way of being able to control it.
Really?
I believe so. I can, people can die at my pace when I decide. They're not real people, so I don't have to worry about getting too attached. It seems to be my kind of way of controlling that fear of death, I guess, and kind of exposing myself to it in the same way that if you're afraid of spiders, you might start off by looking at pictures of spiders.
Yeah, I can see that. I don't give death a great deal of thought. That's probably why I don't deal in it at the moment.
Well, no.
When I'm writing too much, I mean, there's the odd one because you've got to have some jeopardy in there, but it's not the sort of the focus. Although, with my other hat on as a narrator, I have probably accounted for in the last month the death of several thousand people, most of them Romans and Persians and Goths, but modern day people as well, and I'm getting quite desensitized to it because there I am describing heads exploding and la 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 and limbs falling everywhere and entrails everywhere. It's I'm sort of getting to the point now where it's coming into my normal language. So I sit down for dinner and I'm sort of talking about he lifted his weapon and stuck it straight into the steak, and the kids are getting rather disturbed by it.
Well, it's a different way of writing as well, I suppose, isn't it? It's so the ones you've been narrating, they're kind of historical fantasy, are they?
Yes, I think that. They're by Gordon Doherty. He's written a series of books called the Legionary series. He's kind of in the Simon Scarrow, Con Eagledon kind of genre, I suppose, of historical, big set-piece battles, very, very careful attention to detail about the period. And he's writing about the late Empire. So we're talking about, the gradual collapse of certainly the Western Empire in Rome. And the lives of the legionaries who are always fighting rearguard actions against marauding hordes of people shifting around. It's actually got quite a lot of parallels with, if you think about immigration, I suppose, or migration of people around trying to find better economic prospects like the Goths, and yet causing massive problems and pressure on the borders of the Roman Empire, which gradually collapse. And but the actual sort of set pieces, he's brilliant at the impact of all the sort of ancient weapons that they were using and what they would do to a human body. And it's pretty visceral. Yeah,
plenty of crime and blood and gore in those as well. It just goes to show the crossover that exists between genres and the fact that story is story.
Absolutely, yeah. And, boy, is there jeopardy in that. But yes, there's a lot of crime elements to it, trying to discover who's the hidden hand behind. There's always, very similar to Bernard Cornwell, there's always a bad officer who's a bit, up themselves. And there's always someone who isn't what they seem and is colluding with the enemy.
Yeah.
And, it's uncovering that. So there is definitely a crime element and, trying to find the clues on bits of parchment and in the mud.
Well, I'll have to look at those books. I'll have to look them up. And so it was by Doherty, somebody Doherty.
Yes, Gordon Doherty.
That's the one. Okay, I'll look.
Yeah, he's tremendous. Yeah.
Something else I found in the news this week was in the LA Times. I had an article about why LA is the perpetual dark heart of crime writing. It goes into some bits about Raymond Chandler, Michael Connelly, of course, with Detective Harry Bosch. Writers like James Elroy, Raymond Chandler, who I've mentioned there, Walter Mosley, generally mentioning the fact that LA has got this dark heart. It's a city, I guess, of crime in many ways, fictionally and factually as well. The reason I mention that because that's been obviously held up by the LA Times as being the home of crime writing, and I also spotted in The Age, an Australian newspaper this week, an article with the title "Is Crime Melbourne's Biggest Export?" So Melbourne is claiming to be the home of crime. LA is claiming to be the home of crime, and I wondered if we could settle this on Partners in Crime, because as the LA Times article mentions, Raymond Chandler, Michael Connelly, James Elroy. I had a flick through this article in The Age, and it opens talking about Michael Rowbottom, great author, Australian author. Looked up a bit more information on him. He actually lives, he's over 500 miles away from Melbourne, a 9-hour drive, so he probably doesn't count as being a big...
In the suburbs somewhere.
Yeah, it doesn't count as being a big Melbourne crime author. They talk about Jane Harper's The Dry, which was the one that really kind of put Australian crime fiction on the map. The blurb of that book describes it as being set within a day's drive of Melbourne. So probably doesn't quite count as Melbourne crime fiction, as great a book as it is.
Well, it's funny you say that, because my sister lives in Melbourne with her partner, and they describe, if they're within, they're trying to find somewhere to live in Melbourne, and they're talking about being 30, 40, 50, 60 miles away, because that's all they can afford. And it is, Victorians, as in the state of Victoria, Melbourne is a big old sprawl. I mean, the suburbs go on, for miles and miles, almost LA-like in some ways. Obviously not nearly the same population, but they just, because everybody in Australia, certainly in the past, had the right to have a certain amount of land, relatively cheaply. You could buy the sort of half hectare or whatever and build your house. And so people have done that. And so they spread the cities in Australia. So, I think it sounds bizarre to us when, if you're 9 hours away, that means you're in the Hebrides somewhere, from where I am, say. But in Australia, that's not how they see it. They see Melbourne as, they're Melbourneites, even though they're 9 hours, 500 miles away. It's crazy.
You probably, Michael Rowbottom's from Sydney, you probably wouldn't count that as Melbourne.
No.
And, being within a day's drive, even then I think probably pushing it. But don't ruin it for me, Adrian, don't ruin it for me. I'm on a roll here. It also goes on to talk about Helen Fitzgerald, who is from the state of Victoria. I looked her up, from a little town called Shepparton, which is actually 200 kilometres from Melbourne, and she's actually lived in Glasgow for the last 20 years, and says she doesn't actually feel like an Australian nor a Scot, so don't know if she counts as a Melbourne writer or not. So I think in summary, the article in The Age that has the title "Antipodean Noir, is crime Melbourne's biggest export?" As great as all of those authors are, I think it's fair to say that we wouldn't actually say any of them are from Melbourne, so the answer's probably no.
Yeah, I think so. And I would also argue that VB, or Victoria Bitter, which is their local brew, is their biggest export, surely. That's great.
Yes, that's true. Yes. It always comes back to beer at the end of the day, doesn't it?
Well, ultimately, that's my life.
Yes, you and me both. You and me both.
And I was going to say that in terms of LA, I mean, my favourite writer from LA is Robert Crace, who writes the Elvis Cole series and a lot of standalones as well. Yeah. He's fantastic. I love his work. So, yeah, I mean, yeah, they do have a lot. But then, they're all. I can't help but feeling people write in LA because they think they're going to get picked up and turned into a TV series or a movie. That must be part of the motivation, surely. Yeah,
well, it's I mean, it's a great setting for films and TV, and of course, LA is the home of that, and having it right on the doorstep, it's hopefully going to cut down on production costs and things like that. Perhaps I don't know how much things like that go into it. Right, well, I have managed to get through 20 minutes without coughing my guts up, which is a good start. And I might, unless you have anything else to bring up, quit while I'm ahead.
Yeah, I think that's probably a very wise move. No, I've got nothing massive to share with you, but no, it's been a pleasure again.
Well, a nice relatively short episode of Partners in Crime. I think Bob might be back next week. I have to try and get hold of him. He's notoriously difficult to get hold of while he's on tour because he's obviously very busy in the evenings doing his thing and quite rightly sleeping during the day. I don't blame him one bit. I think I might go and do the same.
Partners in Crime was presented by Adam Croft
not the other one,
and produced by Adam Croft. The theme tune was by the Caesareans. The Partners in Crime logo and imagery were designed by Stuart Beisch. Partners in Crime is sponsored by Kobo, your favourite local bookshop, perfected.